Hello folks, this is a series of video lessons showing how to draw various animals. In this one we cover how to sketch elephants with attention to understanding anatomy, design, motion, and dynamic form. Here's a couple important points to remember as we get started. First is I've doubled the speed of the drawing in the video. I've done that so we can get through the video at a certain decent time without putting you to sleep. Feel free to go back and refer to anything that you've seen at any time in the video. The second point is that the drawing may look a little dark here, but I've done that to underexpose it so you'll be able to see all the lines as I put the drawing together. So in general, when I start out a drawing, I combine the idea of the gesture, the animal moving, along with some basic shape design and some bigger forms to get a handle on the entire image. Though I'm working off a photograph, I try to make it as close as possible as when I go out and draw into the field or at the zoo. I keep it light and airy at first because I'm never quite certain whether I want to change a leg or the attitude of the head or something like that before I start building on the anatomy and more solid forms on top of my design. The gesture of the animal is really super important, so I certainly don't want to lose that the more and more I go in and define the forms. And soon after I start to put the anatomical landmarks in, like elbows, where the feet hit the ground, say the larger forms of the head and the rib cage. That way I have an organic sketch. And as I check the proportions, I'll be able to change things and move things around and not have such a outlined, solid, flat drawing. But on the other hand, when I do start to move into those forms, I simplify them. I get rid of all the details and look at the forms similar to like these overlapping cups for the legs, or simple cylinders that bend with gesture. But also, having said that, I do pay special attention to that anatomical skeletal understructure, because that's where the forms are going to bend, and that's where there's going to be a lot of angular line that comes to the surface. That's what I'm using the blue pencil for. So what I'm doing at this point is sort of locating the features, where the tusks are going to fit into it, and then moving on to the skeletal system, but again, not drawing it as like a really heavy-duty outline, like concrete. Is I'm just referring to it. You may notice that I go into things like the rib cage, through the trunk, and then what I do is come up to that scapula, which is that square thing in the front. Then I go down into the leg to kind of establish where the foreground is. You can see in the diagram where those larger bones sort of fit into that leg. And those are important because those are going to become like little focal points, little pivot areas that I'm going to build off of, again, just to make sure that everything looks right as I move from one leg to the other. Make sure that everything's sort of proportional and somewhat symmetrical. You might notice that I just barely use that information on the diagram that I have embedded in my head and just make reference to those points rather than drawing in all the information. That way it's like a post-it note and I can come back to it later and then go work on things like the head and other parts of the body to make sure everything works in concert with one another, so I get a really good design and a really good gestural drawing. You may notice that when I'm using the photograph, I'm certainly using the shadows or the hints of shadows from the photograph, though I'm not copying them. Turning the pencil on the side, getting a wider line for the cast shadows and the coarse shadows on that, and really bringing in the muscular forms right now, not as individual small strands and fibers, but as larger groupings. So again, it'll affect surface form and I can see the bigger idea of what I have planned rather than illustrating and making it all fall apart into like little tiny details. Many people think a big animal like an elephant is all that muscle is hidden. Just the opposite. With the weight and the form there, that really shows up, and having an inner knowledge of that information really helps your design and ultimately the importance and the look of your drawing, so it makes it much more dynamic and much more knowledgeable to you and the viewer. One little technique I use all the time is turn the pencil on the side and use a series of strokes to build up a form so it becomes more rounded and has a little bit more weight to it, and even gets ready for the shading and value later in the drawing. Right now I'm slamming in that green line to represent the ground plane, and I'll be putting this vertical line in for the center of balance, which is up front in the animal rather than being in the middle. Usually that center of balance is right in front of the chest. Now we're at the point of the drawing, I can start concentrating on the head and do a little bit more of a close-up. I'm using a diagram out of the animal drawing book that I wrote and showing you how to sort of break down the face into pieces and into larger forms that will be able to work together, and you can use axis lines to keep all the features in line and symmetrical. Having that knowledge of the anatomical information on the elephant's head or any animal's head really helps with putting together a really convincing portrait or head drawing, because one thing you'll be able to see is how that affects the surface form and ultimately the features, the textures, and even the markings on a lot of the animals. Now if you look at the photographs that I put in here, you'll see this is a younger elephant, and you can see virtually the same proportions and everything on an older one with more texture. The ears are a little bit more beat up, certainly a rougher upper forehead, and more bags under the eyes. One of the big ideas I keep in my head as I'm doing a head like this is the idea that the whole thing's sort of wire-framed, just cross-contour all over it. That way I can keep track of the three-dimensionality, and when it comes to drawing the form, where we come to the edges, I can really turn the form and turn the curves rather than just meeting them up at the edge and flattening the forms out. Here in the photograph, you can see the flatness on the bottom of the trunk, and as the trunk goes up, those really rounded cross-contour forms over the top of the trunk all the way up into the top of the head. Going with the idea of the three-dimensionality, you may notice that I take the tusks, and rather than just placing them on the elephant, what I do is I put the trunks on the inside of that fold of flesh there. That way the flesh goes over the top and it looks a lot more three-dimensional, a lot more to the personality of the animal. In one of these last little areas of coming to grips with the head, you notice I'll kind of dance around a little bit, sort of check out all of my decisions I've made, reinforce some, lighten up others, and then again bring up more of the focal points. You notice I'm sort of hitting more of the surface forms a little bit more, even all the way down into those little compression folds in the ears. Now going back to the whole body form, one of my last steps here is to readjust the outside contour line and the inside of the animal, giving accents like the overlap in the chest, overlap in the arms, a little bit more roundness in the leg, a little bit more musculature, even down to the toenails, and a little bit of the shadow hitting the ground. You notice I'm big in the outline, so I'll come and put one form like the back against the ears, the stomach against the legs, and then even pull the ligaments in for the back leg and make those stretch into that leg that's being pulled forward as it walks. And I want to get the idea of action and implied movement in there. I just don't want to make it a rendering of the photograph that I chose. So I do have a tendency to move things around and articulate different areas so it becomes a little bit more dynamic. Now since we're coming to the end of this drawing, you can compare the photograph with the finished sketch. Now we move on to the second animal, an elephant walking towards the viewer in front of a pool. Now every pose and every direction, even every animal, decries a different sort of methodology to it. And since this is a front view, and since the elephant's head takes up 15 to 25% of his body, I'm going to make this much more of a focal point of the sketch, along with the legs that are stretching to move forward. You might notice that I really jump on that yoke over the top of the back and then down into the legs, sort of upside down U shape, to be able to sort of lay this out and check the verticals against the horizontals of the head. In reality, you're only drawing about 1/3 of the animal, and you really can't see the other 2/3 except hints at it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to really build up those legs and give it my all and put the anatomy in it. But take a look when the photograph comes back up, and you'll see that I took the back legs and shifted them over a little bit so you see them. That way the animal sits on top of a ground plane and sort of you get a forced perspective, and the animal pushes forward more. So similar to the last drawing, I'm using the blue pencil to sort of acknowledge more of the anatomy there. A little bit more of the understructure. You'll see I'll move into the scapula, on the leg, and then I'll sort of jump in and put the front legs in, and then treat the feet, rather than putting all the little bones in, as more as circular drum forms that are stacked on top of those legs. You can see and make those comparisons when the diagrams pop up to the left. I'm going to draw a while here and just kind of fill that information in. Now I've set up all those anatomical and form landmarks, so now I could come in and really start to build up the design and come in with some, let's just say, some final decisions. Again, if I was out there drawing in the field or drawing at the zoo, I wouldn't be able to fiddle around on it all day, or wouldn't want to. So I'd have to see how to sort of abbreviate a lot of this and bring more sort of those natural forms. So you might notice that I'm adding some curves, concaving some areas, really jumping on that three-dimensional form and that anatomy to give it much more of a personality, the animals and the drawings. Perhaps you notice even that knowledge goes down to all the way down into the wrinkles that are on the kneecaps, how they don't just go straight across, but they actually attach to the leg and are pulled down to the inside of the leg a little bit more. It gives a little bit more personality, and it doesn't make it so stiff and symmetrical. Again, I'm going to draw here for a while. A little point that I'm careful about is making sure there's no tangents in the animal. That is, like, say, where that line, that dark line in the chest comes down and doesn't necessarily attach to the leg, but somewhat collides against it. In fact, it collides against both of them. Even that line in the back goes across from one leg to the other. That way there's a hint more of three-dimensionality in your drawing. Even quick gesture drawings can have that attitude to them. Now we're moving on to the head. Those two diagrams on the left are from the animal drawing book that I illustrated. Top one's an Indian elephant, and the bottom one is an African elephant. We are drawing an African elephant. Those are there so you can make a comparison between the two. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also some very, very big differences between the two in the head structure, the trunk, even the ears, the way that the cartilage in the African elephant really fits into the top, and the Indian elephant has two large bumps on the top of its head. As I move into sketching the African elephant, I'm really making sure that zygomatic arch and the temporal arch and the eye fit together in concert with the rest of the skull. That way the proportions will be right, and I'll be able to draw a really convincing dynamic head rather than just a cardboard cutout, a flat representation, which is what I don't want. To improve the gesture and the design of the head, I added a few little different components. Made the tusks longer, I made the mouth droop a little bit more, I turned the trunk in the opposite direction, I'm giving a little bit more age to the ears. In general, I'm giving my spin to the action and personality of the animal, rather than just copying. It's good to do this now because Lord knows you'll certainly be doing it in the field. You'll have to be quick, facile, and confident when you do it. Once again, we can slow down here and you can make some comparisons and look at the finished drawing and compare it against the photographs. Now we move on to our third and last drawing, the back view of the elephant. A couple different points at the starting here. You may notice that since it's a back view, it's really compacted. And so I really hammered on more of the shape design across the top of the animal, all the way down to the feet and across the ground plane. I'm also really going to change the pose and make it work more for me rather than what's in the photograph. I'm just going to use that as sort of a pivot to start the inventive design in it. In this version, it appears that I took the whole body and combined it with the back legs to make sort of a drumstick shape to it. And then what I'm doing is I'm starting to carve the legs out a little bit more, carve the head out I still haven't decided on the front legs yet, but I'm going to get there, and my design is getting a lot closer to the source. I could focus on the anatomy a lot more of that structure. What I'm going to do is I'm sort of breaking it into large boxes at first. That way I understand the eventual light logic and shading that I'm going to be putting on top of this. Building up those large and small forms will give me a visual flow that I'll be able to put the shading on top of and make it work fluidly and enhance the design. Having said that, I am going to put some anatomy in with this blue pencil just to kind of show you where the landmarks are, especially the pelvis in the back. That way you can really see how the light turns over the top of that flatter form, and it shows up a lot more in the final drawing. I'm bringing in the diagram of the elephant turned into blocks. Now, one thing about this is leaning backwards, and the original drawing I did was an elephant pulling a large tree in Nepal. Getting a visual handle on the chunkification of this animal is really super important, because when we do start to put the shading on top of it after we get done with the similar forms there, you will see how those lines, even though it doesn't show it up in this diagram, will eventually all flow together from the leg all the way up to the head of this drawing. So the black colored pencil represents the last sort of accents, finishing areas, focal points, maybe where I want to punch up the anatomy a little bit more, build up the outside contour line, build up some form on the inside, maybe accent some of the core shadows a bit more, even some of the facial features, and still fix things. So it's still, even at this point, you can add and subtract from your drawing, strengthen in some areas like that back leg. I just know I'm going to come in and sort of accent that back leg and give it a little bit more prominence, along with the tail and probably the upper part of the body as well, around where the pelvis on the left side of the contour line hits. One step of the lesson that I will talk about is usually by this time I put a little bit more texture to the animal in, even the markings sometimes. But I'm leaving them out this time to sort of format more the structure and the transparency so you can see how it was put together. What you can see on the left is a page of gesture drawings that I've done at the zoo using the same techniques and methodologies. Perfection isn't a main priority. It's mainly just getting it on the page and making it convincing and confident looking as I design all those animals on one page. Here's another page of drawings that you can see that have kangaroos and people and other elephants on there with notes. That's really important as you guys are drawing, is that what you do is you analyze what you're putting on the page and go back to it and figure out what goes right and what goes wrong with it. So now's a good time to make comparisons between the photograph and the line drawing, the structure drawing of the elephant, before we move into value, shading, and line quality. An important point you might notice is that the shading I'm going to be putting down has a whole different kind of light logic to it. The light's coming from the opposite direction than it is from the photographic reference. And again, I'm using those blocks to organize my concept of it and the flow of lines. So you might see I turn my pencil on the side and I get a softer line, and I come over the top of some cross-hatching that goes in the direction of the form and in the direction of the gesture. That way when that leg pulls, I'm not putting a lot of really heavy cross-hatching lines on it, but instead of pulling the lines up the form so it stretches a little bit more. And I'll tell you, this is where the anatomy comes in really heavy duty if you want to get good at this. You learn where those muscle groupings are, where the bones are, even where the tendons are, and you're able to take that line and straighten it out sometime to represent the tautness of a tendon going over bone, or maybe a rounded area going over the skeletal mass of the rib cage, the linear aspect and the wrinkles in the ankles and such, and even back into like where the squareness of the pelvis comes out that sort of supports that platform in the rest of the body. You can see my cross-hatching lines sometimes go vertical, horizontal, sometimes they're short and long. There's not one simple same line that I put throughout the drawing. I'm going to just draw here for a couple of minutes. That's interesting. If you reference a photograph, you'll see that I actually sometimes use the wrinkles of the animal to help sort of chart out the three-dimensionality of the wireframing of the beastie here. So as I draw it down, I'm trying to really get those lines to kind of weave together to get your eye to move around the composition. Not settling so much on one area, but for you to constantly see the entire animal and then how the small pieces accent and sort of fill in the narrative of the drawing. Bring them up to the eyes, which is really super important, the mouth area. You can see from the previous drawing that I did at the zoo on the left, some real similar sort of methodologies that I use there, again, in the field as opposed to working off a photograph. More drawing, less talking. This is a good time to compare and contrast the photograph and the final drawing. So as we come to the end of the video, there's a little bit of shameless self-advertising here. I've written and illustrated 2 animal drawing books that I think are pretty good, and they really break down the subject matter quite well to different kinds of audiences. It's available on Amazon.com, and if you want to up your game, it'll sure improve your drawing skills a lot. So I'd like to thank you for watching the video, and please like it and leave a comment. Definitely subscribe because there's a whole bunch of different source matter and a lot of content on the inside of this channel. I'm going to leave you with this beautiful video of a large herds of animals walking across the plains in Amboseli National Park in Kenya.